So this chart shows global economic growth. And as you know, if you've seen me talk at many of these events in the past, the global economy prior to COVID was growing at a pretty steady pace. In fact, between the global financial crisis and just before the onset of the pandemic, we had almost a decade of very steady economic growth, averaging about 3.5% per year. Now, of course, the global economy fell into a recession during the pandemic, and it bounced back quite strongly in 2021. And since then, there has been a recovery. We've gotten back to over 3% global economic growth. But this growth has been extremely uneven. It's being driven by just a handful of countries and just a handful of industries. For many major economies, for many major industries, the recovery has been anything but robust. What about the U.S.? Well, the U.S. economy, as we know, also fell into a recession during COVID, but it also bounced back quite strongly, and it's been doing pretty well in recent years, particularly when compared to other developed economies. Last year, the U.S. economy grew by 2.5%, and that growth has held pretty steady so far in 2024. We're forecasting growth of 2.4% for the U.S. economy in 2024. So overall, the U.S. economy has done pretty well. And one of the big reasons for this, of course, is the U.S. economy is home to many of those high-tech sectors and high-growth sectors of the economy. The U.S. has a very strong presence in those sectors of the economy. Immigration has been a factor in driving growth in the United States. The U.S. economic competitiveness is relatively high compared to many of its peers. So this has all served to allow the U.S. economy to do pretty well in what is a somewhat tumultuous global climate. What about the other giant economy in the world, China? China, of course, grew by 10% per year for 30 years. And even before the pandemic, it was growing at 7% per year. But as you can see, the Chinese economy has experienced some very high periods of volatility in recent years. In fact, growth has been relatively underwhelming so far in 2024. The Chinese government has a growth target, of course, of 5% for this year. It does not look like that target is going to be met. We'll talk about why in the future as we talk more about China later in the presentation. What about the overall performance of the world's developed economies? This chart here shows the average rate of economic growth in the world's rich countries over the last 5 years. There's only a handful of countries that are recording relatively strong growth. Those, of course, are the United States, countries like Australia, thanks to its natural resource wealth, although Australia's economy has slowed over the last year, and in South Korea, which has done very well in high-tech sectors and is exporting its way to growth. Elsewhere, developed economies have struggled. We know what's happening in Europe. We've seen a lot of the difficulties for the European economy in recent years. A lot of this coming from Germany, which had been doing relatively well thanks to exports to Asia prior to the pandemic. The German economy, as you can see, has barely registered any growth over the last 5 years and is staring down the face of another recession. Japan, another economy, it's bounced back a little bit in recent years, but nevertheless still not growing at a very significant pace. What about the same chart, but for emerging markets? I've been doing this presentation for almost 25 years. This is the first time that a non-East Asian or South Asian economy has been on top of this chart. Turkey has been the fastest growing large emerging market in the world over the last 5 years. Despite high inflation, despite a collapsing currency, the Turkish economy has managed to generate pretty strong rates of growth. You can see India, which has picked up steam over the last couple of years, growing at about 5% per year, and then China, of course, a little bit below 5%. Latin America is near the bottom of this table, as you can see, but Latin America, at least Brazil and Mexico, have really done a lot better over the last 12 to 18 months. So we're seeing some positive signs coming out of Latin America as well. So the situation in emerging markets is that they've struggled really since the pandemic, but we're starting to see faster rates of growth in many of them. Of course, China is the outlier here, and we'll talk more about China a little bit later. So what are